Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, kick goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave, new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
When we phone people, rather than just phoning, it's really important to actually involve them in not just in the conversation, but in your lives. So, for instance, the other day I was talking to an elderly friend, and I know she's an incredible cook. And so I said to her, look, I've got one egg. I have a tiny little bit of milk in the fridge, but I've got a can of evaporated milk in the cupboard. I have no sweets in the house. What can I do with it? And off the top of her head, she was able to give me this recipe for a cake using one egg and evaporated milk. And it was the most incredible recipe. And anyway, I posted it on my Facebook site and rang her back and said, look, that recipe was absolutely incredible. And so it was something that she was able to do that I hope made her feel good, because she was sharing her knowledge.
welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 379 with Paul McIntyre. Paul is the host of ABC Radio's Medical Matters and has more than 2 decades of experience at ABC Radio. He's also a playwright and author. His book, Use It or Lose It, is a guide to remaining vital through midlife and beyond. While this conversation might represent a slight departure from the usual fare on Future Squared, I figured it would bring a lot of value to listeners when it comes to both living a long and healthy life yourself, as well as caring for any seniors in your life who you may not be able to physically be with during this time of COVID-19. We unpacked many topics from Paul's book, including 1. Why body and mind is a false dichotomy. 2. What to eat for a ripe old age. 3. Exercise and mobility. 4. The connection between sleep, anxiety, and neurodegenerative disease. 5. Community and the value of a flourishing social life. 6. Maintaining meaning after retirement. 7. The importance of learning. 8. Activities seniors can perform to ward off dementia. And 9. How we can engage seniors and look after them during this time of COVID-19. We unpack that and a heap more, so strap yourself in for my conversation with the one and only Paul McIntyre. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And that rustling in the background, just for our audience's benefit, is your dogs, I understand.
Yes, I've made the mistake, perhaps, of letting them in the room, but hopefully they'll behave themselves.
Well, let's hope so. If not, it's always good to have a third guest on the show. You're joining me all the way from I shouldn't say all the way from Tasmania, because I'm in Melbourne, but you're joining me from Tasmania, where you're currently in a 2-week lockdown period. How are you keeping yourself busy during lockdown, Paul?
Steve, I've very much gone back to basics and actually using the telephone to phone and talk to people and writing letters. Most of my time seems to be occupied by writing letters to relatives in nursing homes, friends interstate, friends overseas, and people I write to in prison. And when I've been asked, aren't you bored at home? I have to say that my answer's no, because I've just enjoyed actually connecting and engaging with people again.
Yeah, I've been telling people that as a introvert, I feel like I've been preparing for this moment my entire life, and I'm not struggling in the least bit.
No, and Yeah, I have to say that I'm much the same.
Yeah.
A great shame it's not under better circumstances. But
No.
I think taking the opportunity to, as I say, get back to basics is a really positive thing.
Yeah, and I think I found that a lot of people are just connecting a lot more with others and actually taking the time to, like you said, pick up the phone and actually call them rather than just text them or send them a message on Instagram or Twitter or whatever it is. And also going the extra mile and turning the video on, because obviously we want that face-to-face connection that human beings evolved to derive some sense of, warmth and gratification from. And once that's been taken away from us, suddenly we realize how much it actually means to us to actually have that in our lives. Like, I've been calling my mum every single day, and normally I call her maybe once a week, but now, especially her being on her own, it's just so much more important to maintain those close ties.
Absolutely. And my mum's in a nursing home, and pretty much for the last 10 years since she moved in there, our weekly routine is to go out for lunch once a week. We go to a place called the Black Buffalo, and Mum tends to always order the rissoles with chips and gravy. It's become a routine, and we always get a doggy bag because she never tends to finish it. So my dogs love the middle of the week because it means they normally get half a rissole each and a blob of gravy. But of course, we can't do that now. So what's become commonplace, as you're doing, daily phone calls. And again, writing letters and sending photos, sending postcards, interesting clippings from the newspaper. I've also heard of people, as you mentioned earlier, with Skype and FaceTime, people actually having their grandparents read to their grandchildren over Skype and over FaceTime, which I think is a terrific idea, particularly making that a daily appointment. So say, I think they're doing it, say, 7 or 7:30 each night, so that they still maintain those relationships, which is a great idea.
Yeah. Could not agree more. And I guess we're here to talk about your new book. Well, it's not so new now. It came out in July of last year, called Use It or Lose It, which is a guide to remaining vital through midlife and beyond. So for our listeners who may be, say, in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, it may not directly apply to you personally, but if you have anyone older in your life, be they parents, grandparents, uncles, aunties, someone older who you care about, there's a lot of wisdom that we'll unpack in today's podcast about how you can make their lives better, particularly during this difficult time we find ourselves in. So, Paul, when it comes to our health, I feel like a lot of people take a page, they draw a line down the middle, and there's body on one side and mind on the other. And, you know, the exercises you do for your body, like going for a run, lifting some weights, oftentimes different to the exercises that people think you do for your mind, like doing a crossword puzzle or something like that. But to me, this just seems like a false dichotomy.
Absolutely. And that was one of the most interesting things I discovered in the writing of the book, is that when you do exercises for your body, so your mind benefits. Particularly, I discovered with exercise, sorry, I've got a little dog here, with exercise that of course, as we get older, the hippocampus shrinks. Yep. And one of the things about exercise is that you can actually boost your hippocampus. And of course, the hippocampus is the area of the brain that is associated with memory. And so, of course, there's a link there with dementia prevention. And so by doing exercise, you're not only helping your body, you're helping your brain. And I think this is what a lot of people don't necessarily understand, that they think that preventing dementia especially is all to do with intellectual exercises, when really to look after your brain, you have to also look after your body.
Yes. And even things like, say, trying to quell, say, our anxiety, I imagine you've looked at the benefit of exercise in terms of our, say, emotional regulation and the neurochemical release that we get from, say, going for a run, or if I am elderly, just doing a short 10 to 15 minute stretch, whatever that may look like.
Absolutely. And as someone myself, I've sort of been a person who's had a share of anxiety over the years, which is one of the reasons why I like to practice exercise to sort of help combat that. But also, again, one of the curious things I found from the research for the book was that eating fruit is actually a way to combat anxiety. There were 3 studies roughly that happened around about the same time. I think there was one in Queensland, one in New Zealand, and one in the United Kingdom that discovered the peak of human happiness can be reached by 5 servings of fruit a day and 4 servings of vegetables. And this, when we talk about happiness, this is, of course, also a way to combat anxiety. And with most things in the book, it was something that I wanted to try for myself rather than sort of preach something that I didn't practice. Yeah. And I started eating more fruit, 2 or 3, 4 servings a day. And sure enough, I discovered that the anxiety I'd experienced, particularly in radio, where I was going out and doing interviews and feeling a bit nervous before I spoke with people, I found that if I had an apple, say 10, 20 minutes before I went out on an assignment, so the anxiety dropped away. And there was this feeling of calmness that I wasn't really expecting. And certainly, and it may not necessarily work for everyone, but certainly my experience was that sure enough, eating fruit, eating more servings of vegetables really helps lower anxiety levels. Another supporting piece of research for this particular study, I'm not sure, I think it might have been Jamie Oliver, but in, I think about 2010, there was an experiment, or research I should say, done in a juvenile detention centre in Scotland, where they got rid of processed foods, sugary drinks, and actually replaced the meals with servings of vegetables and replaced packets of chips with pieces of fruit. And they found, again, that anxiety levels just completely dropped away, that there were less incidents of violence, there were less infractions of the rules. And so these juvenile offenders, often with a history of violence, with mental health problems, so their condition improved.
I was actually writing down the word elimination just before you mentioned the fact that they got rid of all of these processed foods. So I guess my question was, how much of this has to do with the fact that maybe it is the fruit and the vegetables, but maybe it is the fact that we're just getting rid of a lot of these simple carbs and processed foods and a lot of junk that just wreaks havoc on our microbiome and our gut and just makes us feel like crap, and ultimately that feeds into how we show up each day.
Look, I suspect it's probably a combination of both.
Yeah.
Certainly, again, just from my experience, I wasn't having a lot of processed foods. I'd sort of, by the time I was consuming more fruit and vegetables, I'd sort of cut back pretty much on sugary drinks and the like. But look, I'm sure it is certainly a combination of both. And of course, when you cut back on sugary drinks, when you cut back on things like processed foods, caffeine, so your sleep improves, which is, of course, another way of staying well and keeping a clear head and making, I guess, informed decisions rather than rushed or panicked decisions.
So when it comes to, say, sugary drinks and processed foods, I know in your book you've looked at dementia and diabetes. I mean, what is the state of, say, dementia and diabetes in Australia at the moment?
Look, it's certainly not good. And one of the things that we focus on, as you mentioned in the book, are the causes of dementia. And essentially 1/3 is to do with age. The older we get, the more likely we are to get dementia, and there's nothing we can do about that. The second factor is essentially genetics. Again, if our parents, if dementia is commonplace in our family, then you have an increased chance of getting dementia. The other factor is to do with lifestyle choices, which is where something like diabetes comes into it, because if you're overweight, that's a factor for getting dementia. If you're overweight, you're also more likely to have diabetes. So again, that's where the two link in, which is where, Again, lack of physical exercise comes into the picture, because if you're not exercising, again, you're more likely to become overweight, you're more likely to have diabetes.
Yep.
So even though each of these, and there are other different possible causes in there as well, but what tends to happen is that one will feed into another. So there, for instance, you have three factors that all add up. And while they might be, say, 3% of what links to dementia, by adding up, so they increase your chances.
And you mentioned sleep earlier as well, and you've just triggered my thinking. I remember reading Why We Sleep by Matt Walker. And in it, he drew a link between a lack of a good night's rest and the accumulation of these toxic proteins in the brain. I think it was amyloids. And that ultimately results in the early onset of neurodegenerative diseases, be it Alzheimer's or dementia. So, and I guess that good night's sleep comes back to your lifestyle, exercising, eating good food, and obviously not having too much anxiety, because you're constantly kind of thinking all the time, and just clearing that head before you go to sleep. I mean, what can you tell us about sleep insofar as what you unpacked in the book?
Well, again, as you say, one of the most important factors about sleep is it's where our brain deals with recovery. And it's thought that that during sleep, so the brain actually fights the dementia that might be occurring in the brain, which is one of the reasons it's really important to get a good night's sleep, because it helps the brain and the body recover. Also, as you mentioned, exercising contributes to a good night's sleep, particularly if you do it first thing in the morning. Interestingly enough, the research shows that the later you do the exercise, then that actually is more likely to make sleep difficult. So the recommendation is to exercise first thing in the morning, so that by the time you get to bedtime, you're more likely to sleep. Sleep also, along with helping the brain, has a rejuvenation effect. It makes us, I suppose, more able to make cool, calm, collected decisions during the day. It also makes our interaction in the day. If you're driving a car and you've only had a couple of hours sleep, then that's not a good thing. Whereas if you're driving a car after a good night's sleep, you're more likely to be cautious and make wise decisions and not be in a rush, because it lowers, a good night's sleep lowers that anxiety level for the day.
Yeah.
One interesting thing I've found, not so much necessarily to do with dementia, but is the study of dreams as well. And I don't think it's that every dream is necessarily a profound message, but quite often a dream can work on the subconscious and look at problems and issues that might be going on in your life, and maybe give you a bit of insight that perhaps you wouldn't otherwise have had. And again, it's not to say that every dream is profound, but I think dreams are quite an interesting byproduct of sleep.
Yeah, and that's something I've heard quite a few innovators talk about, whether it was Thomas Edison or even Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn. In Edison's case, I know he used to work at his bench, and then he'd take these really short naps. So he'd have these two metal balls in his hands and a tin bin rather, under his desk. And so he'd nap and he'd have these balls in his hands. And then once he kind of fell asleep and drifted away, he'd loosen his grip on these balls. They'd make a big crash in the metal tin, and he'd wake up, and then he'd just furiously write the first things that came to mind. And apparently, I don't know how much of that was profound or instrumental in his breakthrough ideas, but that was one of his practices, because he just felt that when you slept on something, it kind of reinvigorated the mind and you just be a lot more creative thereafter. And I think that was something that Matt Walker also talked about in his book, where there is a link between one's creativity and not just normal sleep, but that deep, rapid eye movement sleep that you get when you are dreaming. And apparently most of that comes in the later end of a sleep cycle. So if you're sleeping 8 hours, you'll get the majority of that between the 6th and 8th hour. So rather than sleeping 5 hours and saying, yes, I'm good to go, maybe try and get a few more in.
Yeah, and look, certainly the latest scientific study of dreams show that dreams are basically based on your last 24 hours. So if, for instance, you are having problems at work or problems at home, then chances are what you're dreaming about is somehow working with that problem, working with that experience. And again, it's not to say that every dream is going to be a comment, but sometimes they're quite insightful and if nothing else, I think incredibly interesting.
Yes, 100%. So we've been talking a little bit about exercise. Now, if I'm going to the gym, I'm going to be doing a 120 kilo deadlift. But if I'm, say, 75 years old, what kind of exercise should I be doing? I don't imagine I'd be squatting 100 kilos at the barbell rack.
No, and look, something as simple as walking can be really incredibly beneficial. Also, balancing exercises, and balance is really important, and it's something, and certainly prior to the writing of the book, it wasn't something that I'd ever particularly thought about. But of course, when you do think about it, balancing is vital to staying healthy as you get old, because so many times you hear about people who are in a nursing home because they had a fall and they might have broken their hip or hurt themselves in another manner and are just completely unable to look after themselves at home. Sadly, in my mother's case, that's how she ended up in a nursing home. It wasn't through the dementia, which was fairly mild at first. It was actually through a fall. And there are exercises you can do to combat that. And a lot of people think that these are exercises people should be doing, or we should worry about dementia, when we're 70, 75. But really, you can start at about the age of 40, particularly when it comes to diet, when it comes to exercise, because it's the brain when you're middle-aged that you need to look after, so that when you reach 60, when you reach 65, 70, you've got a healthy brain. A lot of the research suggests now that dementia starts a long time before it's actually on display. And so the sooner you look after it, the better place you are. But getting back to exercises, in terms of balancing exercises, it can be as simple as standing on one leg. See how long you can do it. If you can do it for a minute, you're doing really, really well. And I think a lot of people are surprised at just how difficult standing on one leg can be, whether it's for 15 seconds, 30 seconds. I often liken myself to a bad Kate Bush impersonator the first time I tried to do it, because it was surprisingly difficult.
Yeah.
But if you do that every day, and you might just take a minute out and do 30 seconds on one leg, 30 seconds on the next, and then build it by 10 seconds. You can do that when you're washing the dishes. You can do that when you're cleaning your teeth. You can do that when you're waiting for the kettle to boil. And even though it sounds really simple, even though it sounds like that's really sort of general advice, it's actually really important. And so much of the advice that comes from Menzies Health Centre, from the Wicking Research and Education Centre, it sounds simple, but it's little things like that people don't do that could be really helpful. Again, when it comes to balance, there's something else you can do when you walk, because one of the early signs of possible brain deterioration, of possible dementia, is the smaller your steps become. So when you walk, it's really important to make sure that you take as long strides as possible, which again helps with balance. And what the experts recommend is that while you're going for a walk, that you engage your brain in another activity. So it might be something sort of fairly complex. So say counting back from 100 in sevens or nines or 11s or 13s. Another thing to do might be, say, reciting lyrics from something like the Modern Major General song from Gilbert and Sullivan, where you have to concentrate and get the rhythm right and the words right. The reason this is recommended is so that whilst you're walking and you're taking your long strides, your brain is concentrating on something else. Because what tends to happen when people have falls is it occurs when you least expect it. So you might be in town, there might be someone on a skateboard who goes past a little bit too close and accidentally knocks you over. If your brain is used to concentrating on two things at once, then it's thought that you're much more likely to be able to rescue yourself and to steady yourself, as opposed to if you're just concentrating on walking. So it's all about getting the brain used to essentially doing two things at once. And again, it sounds really simple, but it's really important.
Yeah.
And it can prevent falls.
Yeah, so standing on one leg, walking with long strides. And it's funny how much more difficult standing on one leg gets when you close your eyes as well, Paul. Equilibrium
Absolutely.
goes out the door.
And even things, another exercise is, say, pretending you're walking a tightrope, where you just put one foot in front of the other and just make sure you balance. And you only have to do these exercises for, 30 seconds, a minute a day, and you'll notice that over time you get back to them. You get better at them, I should say.
Yeah, and it's funny too. I think I remember reading something about certain cultures, say in Southeast Asia, where, say, squatting is quite prevalent, particularly amongst older generations. And apparently the prevalence of falls amongst those particular groups of people were a lot lower than, say, in the West, because that squatting just made the hips a lot more nimble, I suppose, and less predisposed to falling over, which I found quite interesting. But it's like you say, it's something that, I started incorporating mobility exercises into my weekly workouts about a couple of years ago in my mid-30s, because it's easy to go out for a run, to lift some weights, to do all that sort of stuff, but your hips, your shoulders, everything starts to get a bit creaky after a while, and making sure you incorporate these stretches and everything else into your workout so that you don't start thinking about these things when you are 70. Start thinking about them now so you're less inclined to, suffer those falls when you're a lot older.
Absolutely. And even getting back to your question about exercise for older people, something like gardening. Gardening is such good exercise.
Also therapeutic.
And I've been very fortunate throughout my career at the ABC to work with Peter Cundall, who recently, I think, turned 93. And Peter is, of course, a legend of the ABC. And when it comes to gardening, I don't think there's anyone that knows more than Peter. But he talks about how the best way to end a day, rather than sitting in front of the TV, is just leaning on a garden fork and wearing yourself out. And a lot of dementia prevention is also based on following the things you enjoy and doing the things you love. And if gardening is something you love, then the exercise that you get from gardening, so it benefits your brain because you're not stressed. It's something that you find relaxing. It's often something you can do with someone else in your family. It might be your partner, or maybe teaching your grandkids how to construct a veggie garden, or what to water when. So something like gardening is actually really, really good exercise.
Yeah, and I guess with gardening, it's kind of like other activities that just put you into that flow state. You're completely present, you're immersed in the activity, and all of your sort of worries seem to just fade away while you're immersed in that activity, and so therefore you feel better doing it.
Absolutely. And again, it comes, you could sort of bring it back to the question of work, because a lot of people believe that if people don't want to, say, retire at 60 or 65, if they want to keep working, then that's a good idea. And like gardening, it comes back to whether you actually enjoy it. If you find the workplace somewhere where you have social interaction that you enjoy, you find it stimulating, and you really actually like going to work, then absolutely there's no reason you can't keep working for as long as you want to. But if you're in a situation where you find work stressful, you don't enjoy it, it leaves you with a feeling of dread, just the thought of getting out of bed each morning, then taking an early retirement, if you can afford to do it, is beneficial. And like gardening, this is why something like volunteering is so beneficial, because it's generally something that you want to do. It's something that, because you're not experiencing stress, because it's something you enjoy, so your blood pressure decreases. So there's lots of things, whether it's volunteering, whether it's gardening, whether it's walking to the mailbox with long strides. All these things add up and are really important.
Yeah, and on that concept of, I suppose, retiring early, say 60, 65, I mean, I've read a lot about people who retire early and the link between that retirement and, say, death. But it seems that that's usually a reflection of perhaps not replacing work with other sources of meaning or purpose or joy. And as you've said there, whether it's gardening or volunteering, which can give people a sense of purpose and contribution, that is something that you should be looking to do if you are retired, rather than just, okay, I've stopped working, I'm just going to sit down and watch TV every day.
Absolutely. And I think, though, it's really important when you talk about meaning and purpose, don't necessarily expect to find it the day after you retire.
No.
I think it's something that if you have interests, then you should follow them from whatever age you are. So, if you're 30 or 40, start collecting something then. If you've got an interest in carnivorous plants, start growing them then, so that when you do retire, you've got that built into your life. Getting back to what we were talking about earlier and how I write to people in prison and to relatives and friends in nursing homes, what I found when I was on lockdown, again, as mentioned, was the fact that I had something to do. I had something that I found meaningful and pleasurable. And rather than actually thinking, oh, gee, I'm bored, what am I going to do today? I spent my whole days writing and connecting with people. And if I retired tomorrow, because I've often thought about it, would I actually be able to fill my time? What would I do? The idea of retirement's a great thing, but would I realistically be able to make a go of it and have a fulfilling life? And certainly with these connections, I must admit, after sort of looking back after a couple of weeks, I've thought, yeah, I enjoy connecting with people through letters, through email, through phone calls, pottering in the garden. And so in this situation, even though I'm not ready to retire, I had all these things that give me meaning and purpose to fall back on, which is why it's really important in this sort of situation, I guess, to have them ever present, so that you're not waiting till you're 60 to think, gee, what am I interested in? That you have them all through your life, and so that they're benefiting you all the time.
Yeah, and I guess I'll use fostering connections as a segue to talk about socializing and having a flourishing social life. Of course, in this time of lockdown, it's difficult to have those face-to-face connections, but I remember having a conversation with Cale Brock, who produced a film last year called the Longevity Film. So he went to the blue zones like Loma Linda, and there was a village in Greece and in Okinawa in Japan where people live to an average of something like 90 years, 10 years more than the average in the West, right? And one thing he said was, you might think you're healthy with your green smoothie, drinking it all alone in the corner, but there's two other guys at the bar sharing a beer, and perhaps in that moment they're actually healthier because they're having a conversation and they're connecting with each other. So there's a lot out there, particularly when it comes to the elderly, on take your meds, here's your prescriptions, and I'm not discounting the value of that stuff, but how important is it that we maintain that flourishing social life as we get older as well?
Oh, incredibly important, incredibly important. And the social isolation is one of the factors that is considered to contribute to dementia. So making sure that as you get older, that you stay in touch with friends. And it can be via the phone, it can be via letters. Obviously, the best way is face-to-face. And it might be, say, as Mum and I do, where we go out to lunch once a week. It might be going to the movie once a week with an old friend, or maybe just meeting up for a coffee. It might be joining a book club. One of the examples in Use It or Lose It is the grande dame of Hobart Theatre. Her name's Noreen Lamotti, who I've been fortunate enough to work with a couple of times. And Noreen, I'd say Noreen would be close to about 80 now. I hope she doesn't mind me giving away her age. But she is a complete inspiration. And as research for the book, I talked to her about, how at that age she's still remembering lines. She's still spot on when it comes to working in the theatre and catching the light and making sure she is where she's meant to be on the stage and remembering all her lines. And she said to me, to keep going, you've got to keep going, which sounds common sense, but she used the example of how people, say 10, 15 years younger than her, so in their 60s, maybe early 70s, got to the stage where they thought, perhaps I need to have a break from theatre to not do as much. And so they might have a break for 6 months and then they come back and they can't do it anymore.
No.
They can't remember the lines. They can't find their cues. They can't find their places on stage. And even though it sounds common sense, to keep going, you've got to keep going. And the reason I mentioned theatre is because theatre is a fantastic way of keeping that social engagement. And Noreen, you go into a rehearsal space and she's normally surrounded by the younger actors or the younger crew members who are just in awe of her. And I think having that interaction with younger people keeps her young at heart. And you don't necessarily have to be an incredible performer like Noreen. Again, it comes back to enjoying it and it being something that you have a passion for and you love. And there's also those social connections. Again, you don't have to be a performer. And obviously going to the theatre at this point in time isn't something that anyone can do. But by way of an example, having a regular theatre date with a friend of yours, again, it keeps that social network up. So, yeah, absolutely. Having social interaction is really important.
Yeah.
It's thought that, again, on a very basic level, it keeps the brain alert because you're remembering, now, the last time I spoke to this person, we spoke about they were reading this book. And it's their birthday coming up soon, so I should get them a birthday card. I should go out and get them a gift. So it's just keeping the brain ticking over. And although it doesn't sound like you're doing much brain activity, that brain activity is really, really important. And it's activity that you wouldn't be experiencing if you were sitting at home in front of the TV.
Yeah. And I guess on, say, certain people, say widowers who may have been with someone for 45, 50 years and suddenly they find themselves alone, I mean, there may be a certain amount of reluctance to get out there and socialize, and because they haven't got their partner anymore. Did you look at that, and or do you have any sort of advice for getting people like that to get out of their comfort zone, if you will?
Well, look, it was certainly something that came up in the research in terms of people that live on their own. And certainly if you live on your own and you feel lonely and it's something that affects you, then that's not good, and that can contribute to dementia. But if you live on your own, for instance, and you're happy on your own, then that's a different ballpark. It's a different kettle of fish. If you're happy living on your own, then it doesn't have the same damaging effect on the brain. It's still recommended that you get out, that you socialise, but it's all about how you feel about certain things. So if you are lonely at home, then it is really healthy to look at ways that you can get out and start to socialise again. I mean, I think if you have someone in your life who has experienced that, again, getting back to basics, and just particularly at this time, it's a really good excuse to check in with them each day on the phone, maybe write a letter. You can even drop hints about, look, a friend of mine was feeling a bit depressed and they got in contact with Beyond Blue, or, they called Lifeline.
Yeah.
So there are ways you can, I guess, sort of bring it up in conversation without necessarily confronting it head on, because a lot of people don't respond very well to being put on the spot. But sometimes if they go away and think about it, they can actually come to the conclusion that, yes, they're right. Again, by writing a letter, you might write it all down and say, look, I'm a bit concerned about you, and that's a way that you can raise it in a manner that's not going to be confrontational, and where they can perhaps ruminate on it, think about it, and take the appropriate action. And sometimes just listening. Just having a phone call, and you don't necessarily have to say anything other than acknowledge what is being said to you, but just let that person talk. And sometimes you might get the same story, day after day after day, but it's really important to that person. And often by talking about it, so again, they might be able to reach insight and work out a way of, okay, well, what do I do now?
Yeah. And I mean, the reason why I ask that is I've got a 69-year-old mom, and my dad passed away about 8 years ago. And for the first few years, she was very reluctant to leave the house, and also for cultural and social reasons. Being an Eastern European mom, there's this whole stigma around moving on too quickly, and what's the community going to think, all that sort of ridiculous stuff. But ultimately, I found by taking small steps, and taking the lead and saying, let's go for a walk around the park. And after a couple of years of small incremental steps, I ended up booking her a holiday to Singapore, and I took her there and I showed her around. Wow. And she absolutely loved it. And that just kind of opened up her mind, and now she's going off and doing things on her own. But I think taking those small steps, as you would if you were just starting, say, a workout routine and you've never worked out before, don't go and smash yourself for 2 hours in the gym. Maybe go for a 10-minute walk around the park and build up from there. So I found that was quite helpful.
And as you say, that occurred because you were there.
Yes.
You were there, you were engaging, you were having those conversations, and you were building it, as you say, incrementally, and not confronting her immediately with, oh, well, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. No, and it sounds like you let her come to that with those conclusions with support and encouragement, which is absolutely the way to go.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think one thing we haven't touched on today is learning. I mean, we've kind of talked about gardening and taking up new hobbies, but how important is learning insofar as maintaining that sort of clarity of mind and offsetting or delaying the onset of Alzheimer's and dementia for as long as possible? And what kind of things might we look to learn as we get older?
Well, it's very interesting you bring that up, because one of the most fascinating areas of the book I found was the area that covered cognitive reserve, which isn't a term a lot of people are familiar with. I guess I like to explain it when you think of cognitive reserve. One good way to think about it is, say, you go to university, you study ancient Rome. So you might study, say, the Punic Wars, the rise of Octavian as the first emperor of Rome. And I know you're an ancient Rome buff. Yes, look, anything to slip it in there. You might study the Severan dynasty, for instance. So you gain all this knowledge about ancient Rome, its rise, its decline. You perform the exams, and of course, being the A-grade student that you are, you pass with flying colours. Then you might go, say, and work for the public service. And you might maybe go to a quiz night where there might be a question, who was the first emperor of Rome, who was the third emperor of Rome, and so on. So it's information that you've got, and if you need to show off, you can hunt it down in your brain and bring it out. But generally speaking, you don't use it on a daily basis. It's something you might still maintain an interest in and read the odd book on the subject because you love it, but you're not using it at your work. You're not using it between, say, 9 and 5 when you're doing other things. But what it's believed happens is that when you get to a certain age and, say, dementia begins, that the knowledge you have on ancient Rome is regarded as cognitive reserve. So the dementia actually starts to eat away at all this stuff you've learnt back at university that you don't need. And the reason they think that this is what happens is because recent studies of people who have died have examined the brains, and they've discovered that people who weren't displaying the effects of dementia actually had dementia. But they think that the dementia was eating away at all this cognitive reserve. So all this knowledge they had gained when they were younger, because they'd built up those parts of their brain which they didn't need anymore. So that's where something like learning is really important, particularly, and this is the key thing, particularly when you're young. So studying, going to university is considered really important, because that is where I suppose you gain most of that cognitive reserve. That said, it's still believed that the older you get, if you keep studying, that's still good for you. It's not known whether it has quite that protective effect that early education has. But it's still recommended. Likewise, when you talk about learning a language is probably the best thing a person can do in terms of protecting their brain. And you can think of it, I guess, as sort of building paths and building towns inside your brain. So when you learn German, for instance, there's 3 words for thee, and of course they attach to different genders. So there's male, female, and neutral. So this is something that you create in your brain, all this knowledge. So again, it's thought that when dementia comes along, you've got all these little areas of your brain that don't affect what you do on a daily basis, but they're the things that you lose first. And even though you still might end up displaying dementia, by having that cognitive reserve, it actually gives you longer
And I think
dementia-free.
Is that also why spaced repetition, not necessarily just for elderly people, but for everyone, is one way to remember things, like the repeated recalling of information you've learned before and application of it means you're much more likely to remember it long term, rather than I learned this thing, let's put the book on the bookshelf, move on. 5 years later, chances that you remember anything you read in that book, if you haven't used that information or recalled it since, is just very, 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 very low.
Look, I think it helps to dip into to those things every now and then. But by the same token, I studied German at high school and hadn't really sort of picked it up for many years. But then I think I was probably about 40 or so 25 years after I'd learnt it, and I was able to visit. And whilst having a conversation was difficult, I was really, really surprised at how quickly it all came back after 25 years. So I was able to make myself understood. I was able to remember, this is the word for such and such. This is where that particular gender-neutral female issue comes in. And at one stage, I even found myself eavesdropping on conversations, which I was actually partly horrified about, but quietly happy that I was able to eavesdrop in another language. But yes, certainly being able to sort of go back and refresh that learning doesn't hurt whatsoever.
Yeah, definitely. Hopefully they weren't saying bad things about you, Paul, while you were eavesdropping.
No, it was actually sorry.
No, go for it.
Well, funnily enough, we actually went back to a tiny little village called Verben, where my mother's family came from back in the 1850s. They were Lutherans, and they fled, escaping persecution. Yep. But we got there, my partner and I, in the middle of winter, and it was in this very remote area of Germany. It was snowing. It was the middle of winter. It was freezing cold. We got out of the taxi, and it was a bit like an old Hammer horror film, because a marching band of people in pagan costumes started down the road and tied someone to a maypole, and it turned out that it was a wedding ceremony, and the person who I was actually overhearing in German was the groom saying to the barmaid at the local pub, which is where we fled, but he actually said, "Sorry, I really need a beer today." and as I said, it was very much like an old Hammer horror film. These two strangers arriving in this remote village in the middle of winter, and everything being a little bit strange.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit strange, but nonetheless a great story to tell. So, given that we're in lockdown now, I mean, we've talked about a few things we can do to help say, elderly relatives and friends we have, from quelling some of the loneliness or anxiety they might be feeling. We can give them a phone call. We can get onto FaceTime. We can do all that stuff. Perhaps we can go and buy some groceries for them to help them offset the risk of contracting the coronavirus while they're out shopping. I mean, what other things could we be doing to help the people we care about during this time?
Look, I think one of the things when we phone people, rather than just phoning, it's really important to actually involve them in not just in the conversation, but in your lives. So, for instance, the other day I was talking to an elderly friend, and I know she's an incredible cook, and so I said to her, "Look, I've got one egg. I have a tiny little bit of milk in the fridge, but I've got a can of evaporated milk in the cupboard. I have no sweets in the house. What can I do with it?" And off the top of her head, she was able to give me this recipe for a cake using one egg and evaporated milk. And it was the most incredible recipe. And anyway, I posted it on my Facebook site and rang her back and said, "Look, that recipe was absolutely incredible." And so it was something that she was able to do that I hope made her feel good, because she was sharing her knowledge. So something like recipes can be a really good way to touch base and involve people. Another way is getting back to what we were talking before about gardening. Growing up in the 1970s, I can remember everyone, certainly in Tasmania, had a backyard vegetable patch. These days, you're really, really hard-pressed to find anyone here who does. So that is something that you can ask your parents or grandparents about. Did you have a veggie patch? How do you do it? How do you maintain it? What are the sort of vegetables I should be planting? Because these are the sort of things, and we really don't know at the moment how long the situation with lockdown and restrictions are going to go on for. But if you've got time in your hands, if you're fortunate enough to have a bit of a backyard and can actually start a veggie patch, becoming a little bit self-sustainable is really, really useful. And things like potatoes, for instance. Potatoes, all you have to do is plant the peels and a potato will grow. Something like spring onions, for instance, rather than actually pulling the plant out, and the same goes for spinach, rather than pulling the plant out, cut off what you need and the plant will reshoot. So depending on your climate, you can have spinach that keeps growing. You can have things like spring onions that keep growing. And these are things that I've learned from older people who've passed on these tips and this information. And it's just it's a way people can save money. It's a way people can make sure that they're eating healthy produce because, if it's coming from your own backyard, you know that it's going to be chemical free. You know what's in the soil. And again, asking older people for that advice makes them feel good. It makes them feel like they're contributing and that they're actually involved in your life. And it's a winning situation all around.
No, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. And this has been a fascinating conversation. I think there's a hell of a lot that our listeners can take out of this, whether they are elderly themselves or more likely the case that they have someone a little bit older that they really care about and want to take care of during this difficult time. People can pick up a copy of the book, Use It or Lose It, over on Amazon, Booktopia, wherever good books are sold. Maybe you won't be going out to a physical bookstore just now. They can also check out your previous book, The Little Book of Slow, which is all about staving off dementia and preserving a healthy body and aging well. Before we wrap up, Paul, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Look, I think a lot of people think that it's too late to exercise, it's too late to make a start, and it really is never too late. And likewise, all exercise is good exercise. So whether it's starting by walking to the letterbox or going for a walk with friends if they might be walking their dog, and again, now isn't necessarily the appropriate time to do that. But all exercise is good exercise, and the sooner you start, the better off you'll be.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Paul. Hope you stay safe.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Gliveski and on Instagram at TheSteveGliveski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.